Okay, in this video, I'm going to look at relative risk, and I'm going to start with a large randomized controlled trial known as the Physician's Health Study. So in this case, there were actually more than this, but it came down to a little over 22,000 physicians, and they were randomly assigned to one of two groups. One group received a daily low-dose aspirin, and the other received a placebo. Well, after some period of time, they noticed that in the group with placebo, 189 of these physicians had had heart attacks, and of those in the aspirin, 104 had had heart attacks. So in the placebo group, we have a risk or a proportion of people who had heart attacks of 189 out of 11,037. So the probability or risk of getting a heart attack in that group was 0.0171. Similarly, for the aspirin group, we had 104 heart attacks out of 11,034 for a risk or proportion who have heart attacks of 0.0094. So relative risk is just the ratio of those two risks. So we take the risk in the placebo group was 0.0171 divided by the risk in the aspirin group, and we get 1.82. That means the risk in the placebo group was 1.82 times the risk in the aspirin group. And while I'm at it here, I'm going to put something else here. There's also something called risk difference, which is just basically, well, not basically, it is just the difference between the two proportions. So we take the 0.0171, subtract the 0.0094, and the 0.0076 is the difference in the absolute sense of the difference between proportions or risks for the two groups. Okay, so that first one we had there was a randomized control trial. And another kind of study that used relative risk is called a cohort study. Here you start with two or more groups with some exposure, different exposure, and follow them over time. So we're starting at the beginning, we're following these two groups of people, and then note whether or not an outcome occurs. In medical studies, usually that outcome is something like disease or death. So for example, we might select 500 individuals who consume alcohol and 500 individuals who do not. So we're going to follow them around for some period of time. I didn't put that in here, but let's say we're follow around for 20 years. And then during that time, we record whether or not someone develops type 2 diabetes. And so here's just some entirely made up results. By the way, you'll notice I could put numbers in here, and it would be pretty easy to do. This is 424 and 558. But I really just need to get, in this case, the proportions of people who have type 2 diabetes out of the total in each group. So I'll leave that blank. If we were going to compute odds, then we would need this one divided by that one. But I'll leave that blank for now. So the risk of type 2 diabetes for someone who has alcohol, we've been over this 20-year period, is 0.152, or about 15, a little over 15% of people who drink alcohol develop type 2 diabetes in this 20-year period. But if you didn't drink alcohol, 32 out of 500, so it's just a little over a 6% chance. So the relative risk then would be the risk if you're drinking alcohol divided by the risk if no alcohol. And so that's 2.38. So if these results were true, and they're not, they're entirely made up. In fact, it could be the other way around as far as I know. I just made these up as an example. But anyway, if this example were right, we would say that the risk of someone developing type 2 diabetes, if they drink alcohol, is 2.38 times as high as developing diabetes if you have no alcohol. And please ignore that little plus sign there. I'll show you why I have that in another one that shouldn't be on this one. Okay, so that's just briefly I'm going to say relative risk has been frequently used in medical studies, and it's usually used for random control trials or RCT studies, a field experiment kind of thing, or cohort studies, an observational study that starts with uh, two groups of people that have some maybe risk factor, here alcohol or no alcohol, called an exposure. We follow them over time and see what um, the risk or probability is that people in the two groups um, experience some outcome, in this case, type 2 diabetes. This really hasn't been used that much in the um, things that I've seen in business statistics, but I think it should be, so that's why I'm covering this. Before I do, I went ahead and computed that risk difference up here as well, just to show you the difference between risk difference and relative risk. So the 152 minus the 0.064. Okay, so back to where I was here. I'm going to talk about relative risk at the car dealership. So we start with 140 customers who select the gold level of services along with their new vehicle purchase. And then there's another 220 customers who selected the silver level of service when they bought their car or truck or whatever it was. So we follow them up for 3 years and record if they purchase another vehicle from our dealership. Of course, we'd like to have the repeat business. And of those who selected the gold level, 60 did purchase another vehicle from our dealership in that period. And of those who selected the silver level, 50 purchased another vehicle from our dealership in that 3 year period. So here I've just put this into a table. And the reason I'm calling this relative risk positive is because I'm looking at the purchases. That's not like death or anything like that. That's actually a good outcome. So the relative risk of a positive outcome, I'm going to call it, or we just could call it relative probability. But I'll stick as close as I can to the language in the medical literature where this stuff has developed. So the risk of a positive outcome given you've taken the gold plan is 60 out of 140, or 0.429, about 43%. That's pretty good. And then for the silver plan, the risk of that positive outcome is 50 out of 220, or 0.227. And then the relative risk would be 1.89, just the risk of the positive outcome from a gold plan versus the silver plan. And so someone who is in the gold plan is 1.8 times is the risk of a positive outcome or repurchasing a car is almost 2 times, 1.8 times 1.89 times is great for those who get the gold plan than those who get the silver plan. Now, be careful in all of these. This doesn't necessarily mean that there's a causation, especially I'm a little more confident in the randomized control trials, and probably not going to do those too much in business, but on these cohort studies like this, there could just be other factors. Maybe um, people who buy cars more frequently have more money, and so they get the gold plan and they buy cars more frequently. So we can't say causation, but we can look at this as a marker. Um, and maybe if people buy the gold plan, maybe we make some additional attempt to reach them because there's a greater likelihood that they will be someone who will repurchase.